The chandeliers above the Charleston Country Club glowed like captured sunlight. Strings played softly while guests whispered in gold and silver tones. I stood at the center of it all, smiling the way a statue does, perfectly still, perfectly polite. After 40 years, Monroe Maritime Holdings was no longer mine. I had signed the final papers that morning. $33 million, a lifetime sealed in ink and crystal. Ethan raised his glass first, his voice steady but distant. "To my mother," he said. The crowd turned, and the applause swelled like a polite tide. Rachel stood beside him, flawless in red satin, her hand brushing his sleeve, as if to remind him who now held him. Vivian, her mother, smiled warmly from across the table. I lifted my champagne flute, watching the golden bubbles rise. The crystal caught the light and scattered it across the tablecloth. Then, movement. Small, precise. Rachel's hand tilted ever so slightly above my glass. Something fell. A shimmer, a drop, too quick for anyone else to notice. Time folded in on itself. The sound in the room thinned. I looked at her. She smiled, that careful social smile that doesn't reach the eyes. My pulse stayed even. I didn't blink. Just before the toast, I saw her drop something into my champagne. Ethan's voice carried through the air again, soft, proud. "To new beginnings." Everyone lifted their glasses. Rachel's eyes flicked toward mine, waiting. I turned slightly, as if to adjust my bracelet. Vivian leaned in, asking about the roses in the garden outside. I nodded, reached for her glass instead of mine, and with a motion so smooth it could have been manners, I exchanged them. The pianist changed keys. Light struck the crystal again. I smiled. The first act of my retirement had begun. The pianist's melody had just turned brighter when Vivian lifted her glass. She laughed softly at something Rachel said and took a sip. For a moment, everything sparkled. The chandeliers, the dresses, the smiles. Then her hand trembled. The glass slipped. Champagne spilled across the marble like liquid gold. Her body went rigid, eyes wide, mouth open in silent confusion. The room gasped before sound even returned. Chairs scraped. Someone screamed her name. Rachel froze beside Ethan, her hand hovering midair. I didn't move. My glass, her glass, stood untouched before me, tiny bubbles still rising. Vivian's pearl necklace broke, scattering across the floor like fallen stars. Ethan knelt beside her. "Mom! Mom, breathe!" His voice cracked. Waiters rushed in, silver trays clattering. Someone called for a doctor. The orchestra stopped mid-note. The air itself seemed to break apart. I watched the scene through a wall of silence. The marble floor reflected everything upside down. Her red dress, the spilled champagne, the panic. The reflection looked truer than the room itself. Rachel dropped to her knees, shaking Vivian's shoulders, voice trembling just right. Tears, mascara, performance. Her ring caught the light. I noticed everything, but nothing touched me. The room screamed. I didn't. I stood perfectly still, one hand resting lightly on the back of my chair, as if this were another meeting, another crisis to endure with grace. Someone shouted for an ambulance. I turned slightly toward the window. Beyond the glass, Charleston glowed quiet and golden, as if nothing inside had broken. I had seen enough to understand the shape of betrayal. The night pressed close as I sat in the back seat of my car, the sound of sirens fading behind me. The driver said nothing. I stared through the window at the city lights, each reflection cutting through the glass like memory. Hours earlier, before the party, I had seen something I shouldn't have ignored. Rachel stood in my study, pretending to fix her hair in the mirror. On the desk beside her was a small brown bottle. The label had been scratched off. My first instinct was curiosity, not suspicion. She smiled when she noticed me, slipping the bottle into her purse with practiced ease. "Perfume," she'd said lightly. "A new one." I nodded, because nodding is what peacekeepers do. Now in the car, her voice replayed in my head, warm, rehearsed, smooth as cream. I could still smell the faint sweetness that clung to her hands when she hugged me later that evening. It wasn't perfume, it was intent. I touched the window with my fingertips. My reflection looked calm, almost cold. People mistake calm for trust. It's really just calculation. I whispered to no one. She planned it carefully. The wind outside shifted, brushing light over my face. I closed my eyes. The bottle, the missing label, the smile, all aligned like coordinates on a quiet map of deceit. The car turned toward the bay. I knew I wouldn't sleep that night. Morning came pale and silent, and I walked into the dining room where the catering team arranged the glassware. Rows of identical champagne flutes glimmered under the early sun, yet one of them caught the light differently. A thin crack ran near the stem, barely visible unless you looked too closely. I traced it with my thumb. It felt like a vein pulsing beneath the glass. I told the staff to leave it. They hesitated, but I smiled. "It's fine," I said. "It has character." They laughed softly and moved on. I kept my gaze on that imperfection. Every empire I'd built started with noticing small flaws others ignored. This would be no different. Later, as the guests arrived, I made sure that particular flute stood at my place. Its crack shimmered faintly under the chandeliers, a scar catching gold light. I liked it that way. Ethan came to kiss my cheek. Rachel followed, brushing invisible dust from my shoulder. Her eyes scanned the table like a thief choosing her door. "Everything looks perfect," she said. I smiled, because perfection is the easiest lie to believe. Only one flute had a crack near the stem. That was how I would know. I turned slightly, letting the flaw gleam in my sightline. The orchestra tuned their instruments in the next room. I inhaled the air. Champagne, roses, ambition. Somewhere deep inside, something in me settled. If there was going to be a war, I had already marked my weapon. The flash of cameras painted the ballroom in warm bursts of gold. Laughter floated above the clinking of glasses. I stood beneath the chandeliers, every light bending through crystal and reflection. Rachel moved across the room like she owned it, her satin dress whispering secrets with every step. When our eyes met, she smiled, soft, perfect, false. I had seen that smile before, the same one she wore when she signed papers without reading them, when she called me Mom in public, but the old woman behind closed doors. It was the smile that meant she thought the game was already won. I returned it. Slowly, deliberately. A smile is the quietest weapon. It cuts deeper than words, and it never leaves a trace. Vivian stood nearby, still glowing with pride, unaware of the poison that waited for her. Ethan laughed with a colleague, his hand resting on Rachel's back. He didn't see the tension in my shoulders, or the way Rachel's fingers brushed the stem of the flute, mine, but not mine anymore. The string quartet shifted to a slower piece. Candlelight trembled across the marble floor. The scent of roses mixed with perfume and champagne. Everything elegant, everything controlled. Yet beneath it, the truth pulsed like a hidden current. Rachel leaned closer, whispering something to Ethan. He nodded, distracted, while she glanced at me once more. Her lipstick left a faint mark on her glass, a red half-moon of vanity. I memorized it the way I memorized every lie she'd ever told. I smiled again, smaller this time, colder. If she wanted to play civility, I'd play perfection. The room applauded something I didn't hear. My pulse matched the rhythm of the music. The stage was set. The weapon was ready. The mask had settled. The hospital smelled of bleach and fear. Machines blinked softly beside Vivian's bed, tracing the fragile rhythm of her heartbeat. Ethan paced near the window, his reflection restless in the glass. Rachel sat in the corner, her face pale, her hands folded just right. She looked like grief sculpted from porcelain. "She just collapsed," Ethan said quietly, voice cracking between guilt and confusion. "Mom, what happened back there?" I kept my eyes on the monitors. "Maybe the champagne disagreed with her," I answered. Rachel exhaled a trembling sigh. "It's terrible. She barely drinks. Maybe the stress." Her tone carried the perfect balance of sorrow and innocence. It would have fooled anyone. Ethan turned toward me, frustration building. You were sitting right next to her. Did you notice anything strange?" I met his gaze. "Plenty of things," I said softly. He didn't understand what I meant. He wouldn't. Not yet. A nurse entered, checked the IV, and left without speaking. Silence filled the room again, heavy and sterile. Rachel's eyes glistened with carefully timed tears. I wondered if she practiced them in mirrors. I looked at the empty chair beside the bed. It seemed to mock me. A place reserved for guilt I didn't deserve. Funny how loyalty changes a dress. Ethan rubbed his temples. "We'll figure it out, Mom. Just stay out of this for now." His words stung, but I only nodded. When I walked out into the hallway, the sound of my heels echoed like a metronome. I didn't look back. Loyalty had just changed homes, and I knew whose door it had chosen. The mansion felt hollow when I returned. The party flowers still breathed faint perfume, but their petals were already fading. On the kitchen counter, a half-cleaned champagne flute stood near the sink. Light from the bay window hit it perfectly, turning the residue at the rim into gold dust. I paused. The same light caught my reflection on the marble countertop, sharp, precise, tired. I studied the woman staring back, her hair too neat, her eyes too calm. People think silence means peace. It doesn't. It means calculation. The sound of the clock filled the room. Tick, tick, tick. Each second reminded me that control is built one breath at a time. I reached for the flute, turning it under the faucet. The water ran clear, then pale gold, then nothing. The bubbles had died, but the truth hadn't. Light never lies. In the reflection, I saw not grief, but clarity. Vivian would survive or she wouldn't. That was now in fate's hands, but the real sickness was already alive in my house. The evening wind brushed the curtains. Outside, the Charleston skyline shimmered faintly. I thought about Rachel's steady hands, her perfect posture, her counterfeit smile. Evil wears polish before it wears chains. I placed the flute upside down on the drying rack. The glass caught one last glimmer before it dimmed. Some people find peace in prayers. I found mine in observation. Morning came with too much light. I sat by the window in my robe, watching the gardeners trim the hedges. Their movements were careful, symmetrical, almost meditative. I envied that rhythm. My phone buzzed. Messages, condolences, questions. I ignored them all. People love tragedy, as long as it isn't theirs. I thought about everything I'd built. The company, the name, the empire. Every success had attracted someone's hand, not to help, but to take. Wealth attracts hands before hearts. I whispered it aloud, testing the weight of the truth. Rachel's hand, steady and smooth, dropping something unseen into my champagne. Ethan's hand, signing documents he never read. Vivian's hand, trembling as the glass slipped away. And mine, steady, deliberate, switching fate with grace. Outside, one of the gardeners waved through the glass. I lifted my hand slightly. The sun caught my wedding ring, still bright after 20 years of widowhood. Proof that gold can shine even when love is gone. The clock chimed again. I smiled faintly. Control was a habit, not a feeling. I picked up my notebook and wrote a single line across the page. When truth hides, patience becomes the blade. Then I closed it gently. Some lessons aren't spoken. They're written in silence, waiting for the right moment to cut. The study smelled of cedar and paper. Morning light slid across the mahogany desk where my files waited, stacked in perfect order. I had always believed numbers were the only things that never lied. Today, I was ready to let them speak. I opened my laptop, entered the password, and pulled up my bank statements. Columns of transactions scrolled before my eyes. Neat, precise, loyal, until they weren't. There it was. Transfers I hadn't authorized, small at first, then larger, all carrying the same digital fingerprint. Rachel Monroe. The name appeared on a boutique invoice, a consulting fee, a property deposit. Every figure had the same rhythm of deceit, elegant, rehearsed, confident. I leaned back in the chair. My breath came slow. Rage never helped anyone win a war. Calculation did. I took out a pen and circled each number, one by one, until the page looked like a constellation of betrayal. $33 million could buy peace, but not immunity. The ceiling fan hummed overhead. Dust swirled in the light, turning the air into a living spreadsheet. Numbers don't lie, even when people do. I printed the documents and slid them into a folder marked Private. The printer's soft rhythm felt like a pulse, steady, mechanical, unfeeling. In the window's reflection, I caught my own face, calm, composed. Behind me, the house stood silent, heavy with secrets. Somewhere down the hall, Rachel's laughter floated faintly from a phone call. The sound felt rehearsed. I closed the folder. The war had begun, quietly and cleanly. I found Ethan in the sunroom, reading emails he didn't understand. He looked up when I entered, guilt already hiding behind politeness. "Rachel told me you've been going through old files," he said. "I have," I replied. "I like to know where my money sleeps." He frowned. "She's helping with the Golden Bay residents. You don't need to worry." Golden Bay. The words rolled off his tongue like a lullaby rehearsed too many times. Rachel had called it a retirement residence. In truth, it was something else entirely. A cage lined with gold, built to keep me comfortable and controlled. "They called it care," I murmured. "I called it control." Ethan sighed. "You're imagining things. Rachel just wants what's best for you." I smiled. "I'm sure she does." He returned to his laptop, typing nonsense, pretending confidence. I watched him in silence. My son, the boy who once fixed my company servers at 15, now a man unable to see the wires pulling him. The sunlight burned through the blinds, leaving stripes of light across the carpet, like prison bars drawn by God himself. I stood at the doorway, my voice steady. "If she asks for my signature, tell her I'll need to read it twice." He nodded, distracted. The glow from the laptop screen painted his face pale. The reflection of the word transfer blinked faintly in his glasses. I turned away before the anger in my chest could grow teeth. Later that afternoon, Rachel appeared in the living room, holding a tray with tea. The scent of jasmine filled the air, sweet and deliberate. She smiled, soft enough to disarm a priest. "You've been working too hard, Lydia," she said gently. "You deserve rest. Maybe a little break at Golden Bay? They have a suite ready." Her voice was honey, her intent venom. I sipped the tea without tasting it. "Rest sounds dangerous. I might start thinking too much." She laughed, brushing invisible lint from her dress. "You're always so serious. We just want you happy." Her eyes lingered on the papers spread across my lap, the bank statements I hadn't bothered to hide. She noticed the circles, the red ink, the silent accusation. Still, her smile didn't falter. "Numbers can be so confusing," she said lightly. "Not to me," I answered. The air between us changed. For a heartbeat, the masks slipped, hers of charm, mine of calm. Then the music from her phone filled the silence again, saving her. Her words came coated in honey, and something bitter. I waited until she left, her perfume hanging like deceit in the air. Then I set my cup down, untouched, and opened a fresh page in my notebook. They wanted me weak. They would soon learn what quiet strength looked like. That night, I sat at my desk with the lights dimmed. The documents Rachel had wanted me to sign lay untouched beside my pen. I read every line, every clause twisted to sound harmless. Hidden inside the legal phrases was the theft of a lifetime, a slow bleeding of ownership disguised as care. I smiled faintly. I had taught myself to hide rage behind elegance. If they wanted me weak, I'd be quiet instead. I called Martin Hale, my attorney. "It's time," I said simply. No explanation needed. He'd seen greed before. He'd learned my tone meant war disguised as manners. Before dawn, I made copies of everything: bank records, contracts, emails. I labeled them by hand and placed them in separate envelopes. One went to Martin, one would go to Grace Turner. The third I sealed with red wax and hid in my safe. I opened the window. The Charleston air was heavy with salt. Somewhere in the distance, a foghorn moaned, long and hollow, like memory itself. I breathed it in and whispered to the dark, "Patience wins wars people never see." I turned off my phone, shut down the laptop, and sat still. The chessboard was set. I would move first, quietly, precisely, without pity. Outside, the street lamps shimmered against the bay. Each reflection looked like an eye watching. I welcomed it. Truth needed witnesses. By morning, the first piece would fall. Martin Hale arrived exactly on time, his briefcase worn, his suit pressed to perfection. Years ago, he'd been my husband's closest friend. Now he was my wall of reason. He didn't waste words. He never had to. I handed him the folder. "They're trying to move assets under my name," I said. He flipped through the papers, scanning quickly. "Classic play," he muttered. "Financial guardianship masked as protection. Clever, but not clever enough." "Can you make it unattractive to steal?" I asked. He smiled slightly. "Let's make your estate unappetizing to thieves." We sat together for hours, crafting precision into law. He drafted a new document, a decoy trust, meant to look authentic but carry no legal weight. Inside it, we planted language Rachel wouldn't understand but would want to sign, a trap built from her own greed. When he printed the draft, I noticed how calmly his hands moved. The sound of the printer reminded me of a heartbeat. "You'll need to keep this copy safe," he said. "Hide it somewhere she can find it, but think it's forbidden." I nodded. "The best lies wear truth as perfume." He gathered his files. "You've done this before, haven't you?" "Building ships or setting traps?" I asked. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. When he left, the house felt quieter, sharper. The law was now my sword, and silence my shield. By the following afternoon, Martin's work was complete. The fake trust looked perfect, stamped, signed, and sealed. The language inside promised Rachel everything she wanted and nothing she would ever receive. He handed it to me in an envelope tied with twine. "They'll sign their own rope," he said. I ran my finger along the string. It felt coarse, familiar. Every noose begins as something harmless. Back home, I placed the document inside my desk drawer, beneath the family photos. The irony comforted me. The rope and the frame, symbols of trust and illusion, side by side. Ethan called that evening. "Rachel says you've been distant," he began. His voice was cautious, like someone testing water before stepping in. "Tell her I'm resting," I said. "It's what she wanted, isn't it?" He hesitated. "She's just worried." I smiled to myself. Of course she is. When the call ended, I untied the twine and placed it neatly beside the papers. A small gesture, but it felt ceremonial. The sunset bled through the curtains, painting everything gold. I watched the color fade, replaced by gray. Every empire ends in shadow before it learns to shine again. That night, I locked the drawer. The rope was ready. The players were walking toward it. Sleep never came easily after the plan began. I found myself drifting through memories instead of dreams. One morning, I walked through my study and saw the framed photograph of Silver Pines. Years ago, it had been a quiet place north of Charleston, a retreat where I'd visited a friend fading from memory into age. She had been tricked by her own children. They'd moved her to a care home with soft voices and locked doors, calling it safety. I remembered the look in her eyes when she said, "Even silver can tarnish if left unguarded." Now, that sentence hummed through my head like a warning. I looked down at the reflection of my hands in the glass frame. They were steady, older, but capable. I would not be locked away behind a name like Golden Bay, not by anyone's design. I wiped a thin line of dust from the picture and set it aside. Memories are only useful when they become instructions. Outside, gulls drifted above the bay, their wings catching light. Everything shimmered in tones of silver, the morning sky, the water, even the air. I thought of Rachel's red lipstick against that color, fire trying to hide in fog. I picked up my phone and made the next call I needed to make. It was time to bring another ally into the circle. Grace Turner answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm, clipped, professional, the kind of tone built from years of seeing the truth behind numbers and smiles. "It's been a while," she said. "Too long," I replied. "I have something that needs eyes sharper than mine." She didn't ask why. She knew my kind of quiet meant trouble worth uncovering. We met that afternoon at a cafe near the courthouse. She arrived in a gray coat, hair pinned back, eyes unreadable. I slid a USB drive across the table. "Bank statements, emails, transfers. I want IP traces, login times, and anything that doesn't belong." She nodded once. "Give me 48 hours. Her fingers brushed the drive like it was evidence from a crime scene. "Truth lives in metadata," she said. I smiled faintly. "And lies die in reflection." Back at home, I waited in my office, the hum of my computer filling the silence. On the monitor, lines of numbers flickered, mirrored in the window beside me. For the first time in days, I felt steady. Outside, the Charleston wind pressed against the glass, whispering softly. Justice had begun to take shape in code and patience. By evening, I sealed another envelope. Grace's findings would soon hold the proof Rachel thought invisible. The next morning, a bouquet of yellow roses waited at my doorstep. No note, no card, only the scent, strong, sweet, deliberate. Rachel's handwriting was on the delivery slip. She appeared later that day, radiant as always, holding her innocence like jewelry. "You like the flowers?" she asked. "They're beautiful," I said, smiling. Even her flowers smelled like performance. She laughed softly. "I just wanted to brighten the house." I nodded. It needed light. Her eyes lingered on me, searching for emotion she could use. I gave her none. When she left, I carried the roses into the kitchen. Under the golden light, they looked almost too perfect, each petal without flaw. I filled a vase with water and set them on the counter beside the decoy trust papers. For a moment, their reflection on the marble looked like fire trapped in glass. I thought of her perfume, her tone, her hands. Everything about her was rehearsed, down to the kindness. I touched one petal gently, then let it fall into the sink. Beauty fades, deception doesn't. I smiled again, but this time it wasn't bitter. It was patient. The roses had confirmed what I already knew. Rachel was beginning to feel safe. That was always the first step toward ruin. The morning after Rachel's visit, I sat at my computer again, the light from the monitor washing the room in blue. Every battle I'd ever won began with paperwork. This one would start with code. I logged into my bank and opened a new account. The name, Golden Decoy. Balance, $1 single. If they wanted to steal, I'd give them something to steal. I stared at the empty balance, amused by its perfection. A clean slate, a baited hook. I filled the profile with believable details, scheduled transfers, old addresses, minor flaws that made it look real. The illusion of wealth, dressed in credibility. Once finished, I linked the account to my email under an alias I knew Rachel would recognize from old correspondence. She'd take the trail without thinking twice. Greed always moves faster than caution. When the setup was done, I leaned back and watched the cursor blink, patient as a heartbeat. The hum of the computer filled the silence. Outside, gulls passed over the bay again, their reflections darting across the window. For a second, I saw my own face superimposed with theirs, calm, predatory, waiting. I shut the laptop and whispered, "Let the trap breathe." Justice wasn't loud. It was quiet, methodical, and dressed like an opportunity. By afternoon, the Golden Decoy account was live, shining like false gold in the sun. I spent the next day baking. It had been years since I'd used the kitchen for anything beyond coffee. But my hands remembered the rhythm. Flour, sugar, precision, every ingredient measured, every step deliberate. The scent of vanilla filled the air. While the cake cooled, I prepared the box. Inside, beneath the layer of pastries, I placed a manila envelope. The fake power of attorney document sat neatly inside, folded twice, sealed with gold wax. I wrote "Thank you" across the lid in looping script. I smiled. I baked revenge in sugar. When Rachel arrived later that afternoon, she beamed. "Oh, you shouldn't have," she said, her voice dripping sweetness. I handed her the box. "A small treat for you and Ethan. You've both done so much." Her eyes glittered. "You're too kind." "I've learned kindness has better timing than anger," I said softly. She thanked me again and carried the box out to her car. I watched from the window as she opened it briefly, curiosity too strong to resist. She saw the envelope exactly as intended. The bait was in motion. The house smelled of sugar and justice. When she drove away, I exhaled slowly. Somewhere between the flower and the forgery, I had begun to feel alive again. 2 days later, Rachel returned. Her tone was lighter now, too light. "Mom," she began, standing in the doorway, "I found those papers you were worried about. I think we can simplify them." I gestured toward the living room. "Come in, let's have tea." She sat, crossing her legs, smile poised like a weapon. Her perfume filled the room before her words did. She reached into her purse and placed the forged envelope on the table, pretending it was a kindness. "You trust me, don't you?" she asked. "Of course," I said. "You do that, dear." The kettle hissed in the background. I poured the tea slowly, the porcelain cups glowing in the afternoon light. Her reflection shimmered across the surface of the liquid, distorted, golden, false. We talked about trivial things, real estate, travel, the charity events she never attended. She believed the conversation meant safety. I knew it meant surveillance. As she left, I caught a glimpse of the envelope sliding discreetly into her purse. Her hand trembled just slightly, excitement disguised as victory. When the door closed, I walked to the bookshelf and pressed the small silver button hidden beneath the frame. A light blinked red. The camera was rolling. She had just signed her first mistake. That evening, I returned to my study. The red light on the small camera blinked steadily from its hidden corner near the bookshelf. It had captured everything: Rachel's smile, her careful lies, the exact moment her fingers slipped the envelope into her purse. I rewound the footage, watching frame by frame. Her hand shook once, not from guilt, but from thrill. The image froze on her face, confidence sculpted in deceit. I pressed play again, recording a backup onto a secure drive. When the transfer finished, I labeled the file R. Monroe Proof, Drill 1. My reflection in the dark monitor seemed older, colder, but certain. "Smile for the lawyer, Rachel," I whispered. I sealed the drive in a black case, then reached for the decoy trust copies. The rope she'd tied around herself was tightening quietly. Outside, thunder rolled across the bay. I stood at the window, watching the lights from passing ships drift like slow-moving stars. The water reflected everything: truth, illusion, consequence. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a breath that wasn't guarded. The pieces had begun to move without me pushing them. Tomorrow the proof would leave my hands and enter the world where lies die. Morning came with the scent of rain. I brewed coffee and sat by the kitchen table, waiting for the storm to pass. When the sky lightened, I took the sealed envelope containing the footage and walked to the courier service downtown. The clerk didn't recognize me. Anonymity felt refreshing. "One package, overnight," I said. Destination: Martin Hale's office. By noon, the drive would be in his hands. By evening, it would rest in the same cloud where every file of mine had slept for decades, unbreakable, untouchable. I no longer trusted blood. I trusted encryption. I returned home, opened my laptop, and sent Grace an email with a single line. Cross-verify bank activity tied to Rachel Monroe. No hesitation. Within minutes, she replied, "Already tracking. More soon." The house was quiet, except for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. It matched my pulse. I leaned back and whispered, "I trust the cloud more than my blood." Outside, sunlight pushed through the rain clouds, scattering gold over the wet pavement. Every reflection looked like a mirror of proof. Justice wasn't waiting anymore. It was moving. By the time the evening wind rose, both my allies had what they needed. The net was closing, invisible and perfect. Grace called the next morning. Her tone carried satisfaction restrained by professionalism. "Lydia," she said, "you were right. We traced a login to your account from a boutique IP address, registered under Rachel's name, the same one tied to 2 new purchases, a handbag and a transfer attempt." I smiled into the phone. "How poetic." "Greed never hides where mirrors exist," she replied. I looked around my study. The morning light struck the glass cabinet where trophies from my career stood, plaques, awards, pieces of past victories. My reflection appeared between them, framed by memory and resolve. Rachel had crossed the line completely now. What began as subtle theft had turned into evidence so clean it glowed. "Send the report to Martin," I said, "and keep a copy for yourself." "Already done," Grace answered. "She thinks she's invisible." She always did. After the call ended, I remained still, letting the silence expand. Across the room, the decoy trust papers lay under a faint beam of sunlight, the wax seal unbroken. Its golden shimmer felt like laughter. In the reflection of the window, I saw my own smile return, measured, precise. The mirror doesn't lie. It only waits for the truth to appear. 2 days later, Martin called. His tone was calm, but I could hear the satisfaction beneath it. "Lydia, it started," he said. "The bank received a submission this morning. Rachel and Ethan came in together. They presented the forged power of attorney form. My clerk recognized it immediately." I closed my eyes and listened. The sound of victory was quiet. "Did they sign?" "Yes, in front of witnesses. We have copies, security footage, and time-stamped verification." I let out a slow breath. "Then let the bank call us." From the window, I could see the Charleston harbor glinting under pale sunlight. Everything seemed normal, tourists walking, seagulls diving. But the world had shifted. Somewhere across town, my betrayers were unknowingly sealing their fate with ink and arrogance. Martin continued, "Their handwriting matches perfectly. We'll have the forgery report by noon." "Send it to the district attorney," I said. He paused. "You're sure you want it public?" "They wanted fame," I replied. "Let them have it." When the call ended, I turned off the phone and stood in silence. The house felt lighter, as if the air had been cleaned. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. It shimmered under the light like champagne. I raised it slowly and whispered, "To justice, served cold and documented." The first chord of retribution had begun to play. By afternoon, the city buzzed with rumor. Bank employees whispered about the Monroe couple who'd tried to cheat an elderly widow. I didn't need to hear the details. Truth has its own way of spreading. I spent the evening in my garden, trimming the white roses. Their petals fell softly into the soil like secrets being buried. The sky turned orange, then violet. I could almost feel my husband's presence in the wind, reminding me to breathe. Grace called while I worked. "It's confirmed," she said. "Forgery, fraud, attempted misappropriation. The DA's office has copies of everything." I wiped my hands on my apron. "Good. Let them learn the price of silence." She hesitated. "You sound calm." "I am. I stopped mistaking noise for control a long time ago." After the call, I gathered the fallen petals and placed them into the compost bin. Justice wasn't about punishment. It was about restoration, cutting what had overgrown so new blooms could rise. When I looked up, the bay was silver with twilight. My reflection shimmered faintly in the garden window, framed by the soft light of the house behind me. I whispered, "The truth blooms again if you prune it right." The scissors clicked once more, precise and final. The morning news broke the story. Charleston couple accused of elder fraud. Rachel's photo appeared first, her polished smile frozen beneath the headline. Ethan's came next, his eyes empty, his tie crooked, his arrogance gone. I watched from the living room, the television glow painting gold across the floor. Reporters spoke of bank investigations, false documents, digital trails. Words like forgery and exploitation filled the screen. They wanted recognition, now they had it. They wanted fame, they got it, I murmured. My phone rang constantly. Acquaintances, journalists, distant relatives. I answered none. Silence was the only statement worth making. Outside, cameras began to gather by the gate. I drew the curtains halfway, enough to see without being seen. Rachel's world had turned inside out. The same people who once praised her were now dissecting her greed. On the screen, a reporter mentioned my name, the respected Lydia Monroe, former CEO and philanthropist. I smiled faintly. Reputation was never the goal, but it made an elegant shield. As the segment ended, I muted the television. The house was quiet again. I poured another glass of water and raised it toward the light. The reflection shimmered softly, steady as truth. Justice had spoken in the only language that mattered, evidence and silence. By evening, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters. Cameras flashed like lightning against the marble facade. Rachel and Ethan stood at the center, flanked by attorneys. Her red dress looked dimmer now, her confidence fractured behind a painted smile. Ethan avoided every question, his gaze fixed on the ground. I watched it all from my living room, the television volume low. Their voices reached me through the walls, like faint echoes of a storm I had already survived. I poured tea, steady hands, measured breath. Justice didn't require applause. It only required completion. Martin called briefly. "Their arraignment is scheduled for next week," he said. "The DA is pursuing charges, elder fraud, attempted coercion, forgery. There's no room for appeal." "Good," I replied. "Let the evidence speak." He hesitated. "They're claiming ignorance, that you misunderstood their intentions." I smiled. "Ignorance doesn't sign legal forms. Intent does." When the call ended, I muted the TV. Outside, thunder rolled across the bay again, the sky lit by small streaks of lightning. I stood by the window, watching my own reflection framed by gold rainlight. Some wars end with noise. Mine ended with paperwork. I turned off the lamp, leaving only the sound of rain tapping softly against the glass. For the first time in years, my heart didn't race. Silence had become victory. 3 days later, Ethan came alone. He stood on the porch like a man waiting for judgment. His eyes were hollow, the arrogance gone. I opened the door without speaking. The silence between us felt heavier than words. "Mom," he said finally, his voice barely holding. "I didn't know. She said it was for our future. She said you agreed." I looked at him, really looked. My son, my only child, once bright, now dimmed by choices he hadn't questioned. "I warned you," I said quietly. "You just didn't listen." He shook his head. "She used me." "She didn't use you," I corrected. "She revealed you." He looked away, tears gathering but not falling. "Is there anything I can do?" "Yes," I said. "Learn." He nodded slowly, shame etching lines where pride used to live. Before he left, he turned once more. "Will you forgive me?" "I already have," I said. "But forgiveness isn't erasure. It's memory with mercy." He lowered his head and walked to his car. The engine started, then faded down the street. I closed the door softly and leaned against it. The air smelled of rain and garden soil. Forgiveness didn't heal the wound. It named it and let it breathe. That night, I sat at my desk again. The documents were gone, the news had quieted, but one thing remained unfinished. I opened a fresh envelope and began to write to Grace. "Dear Grace, you once told me that truth lives in metadata. I think it also lives in memory. Thank you for being my mirror when the world turned dark. You saw without judgment. That's rarer than loyalty. Rachel will face the law and Ethan will face himself. As for me, I've learned something about control. It's not about holding power. It's about releasing fear. You helped me remember that." I sealed the envelope with a gold wax stamp and wrote her name in firm strokes. Then I added one more note at the bottom. "If anyone ever doubts quiet justice, tell them this story. Proof lives in silence." Outside, the moonlight spilled across the bay, calm and endless. I stood by the window, holding the letter against the reflection. The wind stirred the curtains. The room felt lighter, almost forgiving. I placed the envelope on the desk beside the old champagne flute, still cracked near the stem. The story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. The next morning arrived soft and colorless. The storm had passed, leaving the air clear and sharp. I brewed coffee and walked out to the veranda overlooking the bay. The water was smooth, a mirror stretching to the horizon. For the first time in months, there were no messages, no calls, no questions, just quiet. I sipped slowly, the warmth settling inside me. The garden below glistened with dew. Each rose held a bead of light, fragile and perfect. I thought about how chaos ends, not with noise, but with stillness that demands to be noticed. On the table beside me lay the folded newspaper. The headline from yesterday was already fading in the sun. Local couple under investigation for elder fraud. Beneath it, a smaller note read, Mrs. Monroe declines comment. That was my victory. Silence mistaken for grace. I traced the rim of my cup, feeling the smooth porcelain. It reminded me of the champagne glass that started everything. Life has a way of circling back, polishing the edges of pain until they reflect peace. In the distance, church bells rang. The city carried on. Justice, once sharp, had turned quiet again. I breathed deeply and whispered, "It's over." Then I smiled, small, genuine, unguarded. The kind that doesn't hide anything anymore. Later that week, Martin and I met at his office downtown. The walls were lined with legal certificates and old photographs, reminders of the lives he'd protected. He stood when I entered, offering a quiet nod of respect. "I've finalized the paperwork," he said, handing me a folder. Inside was the charter for the Golden Grace Foundation. Its purpose: to support seniors defrauded by their families, to give them protection and voice. I ran my hand over the embossed seal. "You know," I said softly, "when I built ships, I thought steel was the strongest thing in the world. I was wrong." "What is?" he asked. "Memory," I said. "It outlives steel." We reviewed the documents line by line, ensuring every clause was shielded by precision. No greed could reach it. No false hand could twist it. When it was done, Martin smiled. "You're creating something that lasts." "That's the point," I replied. "They tried to erase me. Instead, they built my legacy." He closed the folder and extended his hand. "To quiet victories." I shook it firmly. "To clean endings." Outside, the wind caught a loose paper from the desk, lifting it toward the sunlight. We both watched it flutter like a small white bird, free and certain of its direction. That evening, I returned home and walked to the garden. The air smelled of sea salt and earth. The roses had grown wild again, their stems thick, their petals deep red under the sunset. I put on my gloves and began pruning, one stem at a time. He said roses bloom again if you prune them right. I heard Martin's voice in my mind, calm and steady. Each snip sounded like closure. I gathered the fallen petals into a wicker basket. They looked like fragments of something once painful, now harmless. The scissors gleamed faintly in the fading light. As I worked, I thought of Ethan's apology, Rachel's silence, the reflection of my face in every glass surface of that cursed house. Justice had been served, but something larger had bloomed, understanding. When the last rose stood trimmed, I stepped back. The garden looked smaller, simpler, yet more alive. The horizon burned with gold where the sun met the water. I took off my gloves, wiped my hands, and whispered, "Every ending deserves to grow again." The wind moved through the leaves, carrying the scent of salt and forgiveness. For the first time, the silence felt not empty, but full. That night, I sat by the window with a single lamp glowing beside me. The house was still, the bay outside dark and endless. I unfolded a sheet of heavy paper and began to write in long, deliberate strokes. Each word carried the weight of years I couldn't say aloud. Ethan, when you were little, you once asked me why ships float even though they're made of steel. I told you it was balance. Pressure below, weight above, both learning to coexist. Life works the same way. You've carried shame these past weeks, and maybe you should. But guilt isn't a prison, son. It's a compass. It shows you where you lost your way so you can begin again. You wanted my assets. Find your worth instead. I paused, the pen hovering. Outside, a gull cried against the wind, then vanished into silence. I continued. I loved your father for his integrity. He built everything with hands that never shook. I see those same hands in you, even now. Use them for repair, not destruction. The world needs builders again. I signed my name and pressed a golden seal against the envelope. The wax hardened, shining softly in the lamplight. Then I whispered, "May you read this when you're ready, not before." I placed the letter in the drawer beside the old family photograph, our last moment of innocence, now framed as memory, not regret. The next morning, sunlight crept across the living room floor like slow forgiveness. I set the breakfast table for one, poured orange juice into a crystal glass, and looked at my reflection in its surface. It felt different now, no longer fractured, just quiet. The television murmured in the background. Another headline, "Rachel Monroe awaits sentencing." I muted it before the sound could fill the air. I took the folder containing the final transfer papers, the ones Martin had prepared for the foundation, and laid them flat before me. My signature was the last step. My hand used to tremble when I signed anything. Not today. The pen moved smoothly across the page, carving a new truth into existence. The scratch of ink sounded like the closing of a door. When I finished, I sat back and let the silence expand. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was order. It was balance restored. I stacked the papers neatly, placed them in a manila envelope, and tied it with a gold ribbon. The weight of it felt right, substantial but calm. Outside, the Charleston wind stirred the curtains. I whispered, "Let it go," and meant every word. The world no longer owed me an apology. It had given me peace instead. That evening, Martin arrived with the final documents for me to review. We sat in the study, the same room where everything had begun months ago. The air smelled of paper, ink, and the faint salt of the sea drifting through the open window. He checked each signature, nodding quietly. "Everything's official," he said. "The foundation now owns the assets. You've kept your promise." I smiled. Promises are only real when written. He handed me a small brass seal engraved with the foundation's emblem, a rose encircled by light. "A gift," he said, "to mark beginnings, not endings." I turned it in my hand, feeling the cool metal warm against my skin. "Thank you," I whispered. When he left, I placed the seal on my desk beside the champagne flute. The crack near its stem caught the lamp's glow, glimmering faintly. Two symbols of everything I'd survived, fragility and endurance. I stood by the window, listening to the tide roll in. Each wave brushed the shore with the sound of finality. Then I spoke softly to the empty room. Justice isn't revenge, it's memory, written down properly. The wind carried the words through the house like a benediction. The light dimmed, leaving gold dust across the floor, and I let it fade without fear. The following morning, the garden was awake before I was. Sunlight spilled across the petals, painting them with new color. Dew clung to the roses like glass beads. I walked slowly among them, pruning shears in hand. The air carried the smell of salt and new beginnings. Every stem I cut released a whisper of memory. Each thorn reminded me that beauty had never been kind. It had simply been honest. My husband used to say that a garden is a reflection of the soul. Neglect it, and chaos takes root. Today, mine looked balanced again. I knelt by the white roses, the same variety I had planted after Ethan's birth. They had survived storms, neglect, even winters that should have killed them. Resilience was their inheritance. A breeze moved through the branches. He said roses bloom again if you prune them right. The words echoed softly, both a lesson and a promise. I gathered the trimmed petals into a basket, their fragrance following me as I walked back toward the veranda. The house behind me gleamed in morning light, restored to stillness. When I reached the door, I paused and turned back to look at the garden one more time. The reds and whites shimmered together, like old wounds learning how to heal. Later that afternoon, I sat at my desk signing the final letters for the Foundation's first beneficiaries, names of people I'd never met, each attached to a story that mirrored my own: betrayal, loss, quiet endurance. I sealed each envelope carefully, pressing the golden rose emblem into the wax. Every seal made a soft, satisfying sound, like closure finding its place. Martin had arranged a press release, but I declined interviews. The Foundation didn't need my face. It needed purpose. I wanted the story to live without vanity. Through the open window, the sound of the ocean reached me. Gentle, constant, patient. I thought about all the noise that used to fill my life: arguments, phone calls, polite lies. Now there was only the rhythm of paper and tide. I glanced at the framed photograph of my husband. "We built ships," I murmured. "Now we build trust." The afternoon light warmed the edges of the desk. The envelopes gleamed softly, a fleet of promises ready to sail. I leaned back, exhaling. For once, creation didn't come from ambition, but peace. Every storm leaves something behind. Mine left a foundation made of silence, truth, and names that would not be forgotten. As the sun descended, I walked to the edge of the bay. The sky had turned to gold dust and silver water, the colors merging like forgiveness. The wind tugged gently at my scarf. I carried a small glass of champagne, not for celebration, but remembrance. I stood by the railing where the view stretched endlessly. Waves touched the shore, steady as a heartbeat. I raised the glass to the horizon. "For everything lost," I whispered, "and everything found." The liquid caught the last light of day, glowing amber before fading to clear. I set the glass down beside me and watched the tide creep closer, swallowing the reflection whole. Somewhere far behind me, the house lights flickered on. Inside, life waited, quiet, complete. I thought about Rachel, about Ethan, about how grief and greed had collided and transformed into understanding. Justice had never been about punishment. It was about balance returning to its rightful place. As twilight deepened, I turned toward the house. The garden rustled softly, the air filled with the scent of roses and salt. Each step felt lighter, freer. The past was behind me, the wind at my back. The sea whispered my name once, then fell silent. That night, I sat in the study again. The lamp glowed softly, casting long shadows across the shelves. The air smelled faintly of old paper and salt. I took a sheet of stationery from the drawer and began to write my final letter. This one, not to anyone specific, but to time itself. To whoever finds these words, know that justice can be quiet. It doesn't shout, it doesn't break doors. It waits until truth has ripened and falls on its own. What you've heard of me may change, but the facts won't. I lived, I lost, I learned to stand without applause. If you ever face betrayal, do not beg for understanding. Build evidence, build calm, build dignity. Those three things last longer than anger ever will. I paused, letting the ink settle. The pen felt heavy, but my heart did not. Forgive when you can, forget when you must, and remember only what teaches you how to breathe again. I folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it with gold wax. Then I wrote one word on the front: legacy. I placed it in the top drawer beside the first contract I ever signed as CEO, the one that had started everything. The circle felt complete. When I turned off the lamp, the room didn't darken. It simply rested. The air outside was soft, the kind Charleston saves for its gentlest evenings. The wind carried traces of jasmine and tidewater. I walked slowly down the stone path that led to the garden gate, my steps echoing faintly. The neighborhood was quiet. Only the faint hum of the bay and the rhythmic chirp of crickets filled the distance. I passed the rose bushes, their petals half closed in the fading light. The smell was comforting, familiar, alive. I thought about how life had begun again, not with triumph, but with stillness. The years I had spent chasing control had ended in surrender, and it didn't feel like loss. Near the garden's edge, I stopped and looked toward the water. The reflection of my house shimmered faintly in the ripples, gold, ivory, silver gray, the same colors that had marked each act of my story. The wind brushed against my face. I closed my eyes and listened. No voices, no applause, just rhythm. When I opened them again, a single rose petal drifted past my hand, caught by the wind, carried toward the sea. I let it go. Peace, I realized, doesn't arrive with closure. It arrives when you no longer chase it. Later, I stood once more on the veranda. The stars hung low, reflecting off the water like shards of quiet glass. I brought with me one last item, the cracked champagne flute. Its fracture caught the starlight, thin and beautiful. I placed it on the railing beside a sealed envelope addressed to Ethan. The letter waited under the weight of the brass seal, unmoving, final. The breeze lifted strands of my hair, carrying the scent of roses and salt. I looked out at the bay, calm and endless. Somewhere out there, ships moved through the dark, steady, unseen, following courses written in quiet precision. I whispered, "Justice isn't revenge. It's memory, written down properly." The words felt lighter this time, like truth had finally exhaled. I turned the glass upside down, resting it carefully beside the letter. The wind stirred, gentle but sure. For a long moment I stood there, breathing with the rhythm of the tide. The sound of the water against the shore was the only heartbeat I needed. Then I smiled faintly and whispered to the night, "It's done." The wind carried the words across the bay, dissolving them into light. Dawn came soft and pale, stretching gold light across the bay. The air smelled clean, rinsed by wind. I stood by the window, watching the horizon brighten until the sea and sky blended into one sheet of light. The house behind me was silent, but not empty. It felt settled. On the veranda, the letter and the upside-down champagne flute still rested exactly where I'd left them. Dew gathered along the railing, beating like pearls. I stepped outside, the wood cool beneath my bare feet, and traced a finger along the glass. It was smooth, unbroken, still holding the memory of everything it had witnessed. The envelope's gold seal caught the sun, glowing faintly. I lifted it, smiled, and carried it inside. It would reach Ethan soon, when the time was right. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the steam curling upward. The ticking clock filled the quiet. Every second sounded deliberate, no longer rushed. For the first time in years, time wasn't an enemy. It was a companion. Outside, gulls circled the shoreline. Their cries felt softer now, less like mourning, more like return. I whispered to the empty room, "It's a new tide." The words lingered, calm and final, blending with the hum of morning light. 2 weeks later, the Golden Grace Foundation opened its doors. The first letters had gone out, the first checks delivered. People I'd never met, names from court filings, quiet victims, now had something steady beneath their feet. I stood by the window of the new office downtown, watching the crowd gather for the ribbon cutting. Martin spoke briefly to the press, his words simple. This foundation exists because one woman refused to stay silent. I didn't attend the ceremony. My presence wasn't needed. I'd built enough spotlights in my life. It was time for others to stand beneath them. Grace sent me a photo later that afternoon, a small group of elderly women holding the foundation's gold brochures, smiling with quiet pride. In the background, sunlight streamed through the glass walls, scattering reflections across their faces. I saved the photo on my phone and stared at it for a long while. Not pride, not triumph, just peace. The brochure's front line read, "For those who were silenced, may truth speak again." I turned off the phone and looked toward the bay. The light had shifted to ivory, soft and forgiving. Everything felt right where it belonged. That evening I returned home earlier than usual. The garden glowed faintly in the dusk, the roses pale gold under the fading sun. I poured a small glass of champagne, not to toast, but to remember. I walked to the veranda, the same spot where everything had turned all those weeks ago. The air was warm, the wind carrying the sound of the water lapping against the dock. I placed the glass on the railing and leaned forward, resting my hands beside it. The bay shimmered like liquid light. My reflection looked softer now, lined not with age, but with completion. I whispered, "Every storm ends somewhere." Somewhere behind me, a clock chimed 7. I let the sound fade into the evening. I thought of Ethan, rebuilding, of Grace, still investigating truth, of Martin, protecting others with the same calm diligence that had saved me. Justice had done its work. Peace had followed quietly, like a shadow that chose to stay. I lifted the glass, let the bubbles rise and vanish, then set it down. The wind brushed my sleeve, carrying the faint scent of roses. And for the first time, I felt free, not from them, but from the story itself. It was late afternoon when Grace arrived. The sky was turning amber, and the garden shimmered under the fading light. She walked up the path with her usual calm, gray coat, steady pace, the kind of composure that made truth look effortless. I met her at the veranda, where the sea breeze carried the faint sound of waves colliding with the pier. "I thought you'd be busy," I said. "I was," she replied, setting her briefcase on the table. "But some stories don't close without witnesses." We sat facing the bay. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was not empty. It was full of things already understood. She finally said, "Rachel entered a plea deal this morning. She confessed to everything. The DA will finalize sentencing next week." I nodded. "Good. Let her learn the price of calculation without conscience." Grace studied me for a moment. "You could have destroyed them louder." "I didn't need to," I said softly. "The truth had a microphone of its own." She smiled faintly. "You've changed, Lydia." "No," I answered. "I just remembered who I was before noise." The wind lifted a strand of my hair, carrying it across my face. Grace looked out toward the water. "It's quiet here." "That's how I keep it," I said. And for a moment, we both just listened, to the waves, the faint ticking of the old clock inside, the life that had found its balance again. After Grace left, I returned to the study. The sunlight had gone, leaving only the lamp's golden halo spilling over the desk. There, in the top drawer, still lay the letter I'd written to Ethan. Weeks had passed, yet I hadn't sent it. I took it out, ran my thumb across the seal, still unbroken. His name glimmered faintly in ink. I imagined him somewhere across the city, perhaps working, perhaps rebuilding, carrying the quiet weight of consequence. I considered sending it tonight. Then I hesitated. Some lessons only settle when silence does the teaching. I placed it back inside, beside the letter titled Legacy. Maybe one day he'd find both. Maybe he wouldn't. Either way, they were written. That was enough. I turned off the lamp and looked around the room. The shadows looked gentle now, not threatening. The champagne flute still sat on the shelf, its crack glinting faintly under the moonlight. I whispered, "Some things aren't meant to be delivered. They're meant to be remembered." Outside, the waves pressed softly against the dock. The night folded itself around the house like a blanket. I let it. The following morning I woke before sunrise. The air was cool, crisp, touched with the scent of the sea. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and stepped outside. The horizon glowed faintly pink, streaked with silver. I walked down the garden path, past the roses now heavy with dew. The bay was calm, the tide just beginning to rise. At the railing, I paused and breathed deeply. The same spot where fear once began now felt like home again. The wind over the bay carried a low hum, soft and endless. It brushed against my face, moved through my hair, and whispered against the water's surface. I whispered back, "I hear you." For a long time I stood there, letting the air move through me, past, present, and everything in between. The story had finished, but the life after it had only just begun. Behind me, the house glowed in early light. Inside, the papers, the roses, the letters, all exactly where they belonged. The wind rose again, stronger now, lifting the scent of the sea and scattering it into morning. I closed my eyes and smiled. Every justice ends with silence. Every silence, if you listen long enough, becomes peace. By mid-morning, the bay was alive again. Sunlight rippled across the water, and the wind that had carried my words the night before returned, gentle, forgiving. I stood on the veranda holding a porcelain cup of coffee, its surface trembling slightly with each gust. The world looked the same, but everything inside it had changed. From this distance, the past seemed small. The party, the poison, the silence, all folded into one precise memory that no longer burned. It simply existed. The champagne flute still rested on the railing, its crack glinting faintly like an old scar that had learned to live with itself. I reached for it, turning it once in my hand. The glass caught the sun and scattered it across the wall in tiny fragments of gold. I whispered, "You were never broken. You were proof." A single seagull crossed the horizon. Its wings cast a brief shadow over the garden below, where the roses swayed gently in the breeze. Everything was in motion again, just enough to remind me that peace doesn't mean stillness. It means harmony. I finished my coffee, set the cup beside the flute, and closed my eyes. The wind brushed across my face like a benediction. The story had found its ending, and I had found my beginning inside it. That afternoon, clouds drifted across the sky, turning the bay silver. I sat at my desk and opened the old journal I'd once used for company notes. The first page was dated decades ago, written in the hurried handwriting of ambition. The final page waited, blank and patient. I picked up my pen and wrote, "Monroe Maritime Holdings, sold, closed, forgiven." Then below it, Golden Grace Foundation, active, growing, eternal. The ink dried slowly. I closed the book and placed it beside the brass seal. The weight of it grounded me. I caught my reflection in the window, lines deeper now, but softened. Not every mark on a face is age. Some are proof of endurance. Outside, the tide began to pull away, leaving ripples that shimmered under the afternoon light. Each one caught the sky like a mirror. I thought of everything I had lost and everything I had gained, and for once, the scales felt even. The clock in the hallway chimed. Time no longer chased me. It accompanied me. I smiled at the sound. I whispered, "Let the record show. I lived with intention." Evening descended in quiet layers of gold and silver. The sea stretched wide beneath it, endless and calm. I stepped outside one last time, carrying nothing but a small envelope. Inside was a single note addressed to myself. "Remember peace when noise returns." I placed it beneath the champagne flute and turned it upside down, the same way I had that night at the country club. The gesture felt ceremonial, a circle closing, a vow kept. The wind over Charleston Bay rose, moving through the roses, the veranda, the open door behind me. It filled the house with the faint rustle of leaves and paper, a lullaby for endings. I looked toward the horizon, where light met water. The sun dipped lower, its reflection shimmering like liquid gold. I thought of my husband, of Ethan, of every version of myself I had been, and how each had led me here. Justice wasn't revenge. It was memory, written down properly. I whispered the words again, softly this time, letting them fade into the wind. Then I walked back inside, closing the door with care. The sound was gentle, final, and full of peace. The baylight lingered for a moment longer, then slowly disappeared. The next morning arrived washed in gold. Light poured through the sheer curtains, touching everything it met, the papers on my desk, the brass seal, even the cracks in the champagne flute. I stood by the window, barefoot, holding a cup of tea that steamed in the quiet air. The house breathed around me, alive but calm. The garden outside glowed like something reborn. Dew shone on the rose leaves. Their color had deepened overnight, from red to something closer to ember. I thought of how even light learns patience, how it waits for clouds to pass before revealing its full warmth. I sat on the veranda and listened. Seagulls drifted in the distance. A soft hum of waves touched the shore. Every sound felt deliberate, placed exactly where it belonged. The papers for the Foundation's first expansion lay on the table beside me. I would sign them later, not out of duty, but desire. Building again, but differently this time. Not ships, not wealth. Something invisible, yet steady. I lifted my cup toward the horizon. To the quiet things, I whispered. The ones that last. The light over Charleston shifted, deepening into gold, the kind that makes everything look forgiven. Around midday, I heard footsteps on the gravel path. I turned to see a young woman standing at the gate, holding a folder to her chest. She wore a modest dress, her face lit with both nervousness and awe. "Mrs. Monroe?" she asked. "Yes," I said, smiling. "Come in." She introduced herself as Marjorie Lane, one of the first scholarship recipients from the Golden Grace Foundation. Her eyes glimmered with the same mix of humility and determination I remembered from my younger self. "I just wanted to thank you," she said softly. "You gave me more than help. You gave me dignity." Her words landed like music, low and sincere. I invited her to sit. We talked about her studies, her dreams, her plans to help other families facing injustice. She reminded me that goodness wasn't a relic. It could be taught, multiplied, passed down. Before leaving, she handed me a small watercolor she'd painted, a field of white roses under golden light. "For your peace," she said. After she left, I held the painting for a long while. The brushstrokes were uneven, honest, alive. I placed it on the wall near the veranda door. It belonged there, between light and memory. That evening, the sky turned lavender and silver, the air heavy with the scent of the bay. I sat at my desk again, a blank page before me. Not to record facts, not to list accounts, just to write to the woman I had become. Dear Lydia, you waited too long to rest, but you never forgot to rise. You were betrayed, but you never let it make you cruel. You learned that silence isn't emptiness, it's strength waiting to be understood. You built ships that carried the world's weight, and then you built peace that carried your own. That's legacy. I signed the page and folded it carefully, tucking it into the same drawer that held all my letters. The wax seal wasn't needed this time. Some truths are already sealed by time itself. Outside, the wind stirred gently, moving through the curtains. The bay reflected the last color of dusk, glowing softly like forgiveness. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I'm still here." The house exhaled in answer, quiet and whole. The day faded slowly, as if reluctant to leave. The bay had turned to molten gold, the kind that feels too beautiful to touch. I sat on the veranda again, watching the light move through the air like liquid time. On the table lay the watercolor Marjorie had given me, now framed in simple wood. Its softness reminded me that peace often arrives in humble forms. As I traced the edges of the frame, I heard a knock at the gate. It was the delivery boy, young, polite, slightly out of breath. "Package for you, ma'am," he said, holding a small box wrapped in brown paper. Inside, I found a crystal ornament in the shape of a rose. No note, no sender, just light caught in glass. I turned it over in my hand. The petals refracted the sunset, scattering gold across the wall. A quiet smile rose to my lips. I didn't need to know who sent it. Some gestures speak louder when they travel without names. I placed the glass rose beside the old champagne flute. Both caught the same light, one born of pain, the other of gratitude. Together, they shimmered like forgiveness made visible. The sun dipped lower, and for a moment, the house glowed as if lit from within. After nightfall, the house settled into silence. I walked through each room slowly, letting my hand brush across the familiar furniture, the photographs, the books that had kept me company through decades. Every object felt lighter, as if it no longer carried the burden of memory, but the grace of endurance. In the hallway mirror, I caught my reflection. The woman who looked back wasn't the one from the party, nor the one who'd sat in hospital corridors waiting for deceit to unfold. Her face was calmer now, the edges softened by peace. I whispered to the reflection, "You made it." Moonlight slipped through the windows, painting silver lines across the floor. I followed them to the study. The letters lay neatly stacked, untouched. The brass seal glimmered faintly beside them. I sat down at the desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out the first document I had ever signed, the company charter, yellowed and thin. I smiled. Everything I had once built had led here, to stillness, to wisdom, to freedom from needing anything more. I closed the drawer, extinguished the lamp, and let the moonlight finish the story. Morning returned quietly, soft as breath. I walked to the bay with bare feet, the sand cool beneath me. The tide had come in higher than usual, washing over the rocks with steady rhythm. I carried nothing but a folded letter in my hand, the one addressed simply to myself. At the edge of the pier, I unfolded it one last time, reading in the hush of dawn. The words no longer felt like mine. They belonged to someone I had been, someone who had survived and then learned to live. I folded the paper again, held it to my lips for a moment, and set it gently on the water. The tide took it without resistance. The page floated outward, turning, glinting, dissolving into the golden surface until it vanished completely. I stood there, eyes closed, letting the wind fill my lungs. The sound of the waves became a heartbeat. Behind me, the house waited, bathed in morning light. Ahead, the horizon shimmered like a door opening. I whispered, "Every ending is just light, finding another surface." Then I turned toward home, the sea at my back, the story at rest, and peace finally written in full. When I returned from the bay, the house felt warmer than before. The morning light had reached every corner, soft and gold. The air smelled faintly of salt and roses. I placed my shawl on the chair by the door and paused to listen. Not a sound. No ticking clock, no hum of appliances, just the quiet that arrives after everything necessary has been said. I walked through the hallway, each step echoing softly against the wooden floor. The champagne flute still stood by the window, its crack now glowing like a signature. The glass rose beside it shimmered with the same light. Two truths side by side, what broke me and what saved me. I poured myself a cup of tea and stood before the window. Outside, the garden swayed with the rhythm of the sea breeze. I thought about how many times I had looked through this same glass and seen only fear or betrayal. Now all I saw was motion, life continuing without permission, without apology. I whispered, "Welcome home." And for the first time in my life, the house seemed to answer. That evening, the sound of tires on gravel pulled me from my thoughts. I stepped onto the veranda to see a familiar car stop by the gate. Ethan climbed out slowly, holding a bouquet of white roses. His expression carried humility, not sorrow, a difference I felt before he even spoke. He approached quietly. "Mom," he said, his voice low, "I thought I'd bring these. For peace." I looked at the flowers, simple, unpretentious, real. I took them gently and nodded. "They're beautiful." He shifted, unsure whether to leave. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he said. "Maybe not," I replied softly, "but you deserve a chance to learn from it." We stood together in the fading light, saying little. The sky turned violet, the air humming with crickets. For the first time in years, silence between us wasn't painful. It was a bridge. Before he left, he said, "I read your letter." I smiled faintly. "Then you know everything I needed to say." He nodded once, his eyes clear, then walked back to the car. I watched the taillights fade down the road. The roses in my hand felt warm from the sunset. Peace, I realized, sometimes comes walking back on tired feet. After Ethan left, I placed the roses in a crystal vase beside the flute and the glass rose. The three caught the last light of day, turning the room into a quiet cathedral of reflection. I stood there for a long time, watching the sun sink into the water. The horizon glowed gold one last time before fading to silver. The bay reflected it perfectly, still, eternal, forgiving. I whispered to the light, "You can rest now." The words felt final but not sad. Closure didn't mean ending. It meant peace finally staying long enough to be believed. I walked to the garden once more. The roses brushed against my sleeves as I passed. The air was cool, the sea calm. I turned toward the house, its windows glowing softly behind me, and smiled. The wind rose gently, lifting my hair, carrying the scent of the bay and the echo of all that had been learned. In that moment, I understood something simple. Life had not taken anything from me. It had returned everything, purified by silence. I whispered one last time, "Justice isn't revenge, it's memory, remembered kindly." The bay answered with a single wave against the shore, soft as applause. The morning of the Foundation's first anniversary arrived calm and bright. Charleston woke beneath a veil of golden light, the air thick with promise. I dressed simply, a cream blouse, pearl earrings, the same gold bracelet my husband once gave me when the company launched its first ship. Symbols of beginnings, now reborn for quieter reasons. At the downtown office, a small crowd had gathered, beneficiaries, volunteers, old friends. Martin stood near the podium, reading over his notes. Grace was by the door, her hands clasped, watching the sunlight climb across the marble floor. When she saw me, she smiled, a rare, genuine smile that carried gratitude and pride. I didn't speak during the ceremony. My words were already written in every face standing there. Survivors, builders, the quietly strong. When Martin mentioned my name, the crowd turned, but I stayed still. I wasn't the story anymore, only its author. Afterward, a young woman approached me, carrying a bouquet of small white roses. "For you, Mrs. Monroe," she said. "Thank you for helping us bloom." Her voice trembled slightly, like wind through water. I accepted the flowers and touched her hand. "No," I said softly. "You helped yourselves. I only kept the door open." As the event ended, I stepped outside. The sky was clear, the harbor alive with movement, boats crossing, gulls circling, the horizon endless. I walked toward the pier, holding the bouquet close. The wind lifted the petals, scattering a few into the air, carrying them toward the water. I looked out across the bay and whispered, "Golden Grace." It wasn't just the name of the foundation anymore. It was a prayer, a philosophy, the belief that justice, when done quietly, becomes light that never fades. The sun dipped lower, and its reflection spread across the water like molten gold. The same light touched my face, warm and forgiving. I closed my eyes and let the wind move through me. The sea hummed softly, like memory breathing. Everything, betrayal, revelation, redemption, had led here, to grace, to stillness, to the kind of peace that doesn't end when the story does. I smiled, the corners of my eyes softening with contentment. The roses brushed against my wrist as the tide rose higher, whispering against the dock. The wind carried one final phrase through the air, faint but sure. Justice isn't revenge, it's grace, returned in gold. The bay shimmered in answer, and for a long, still moment, everything was light.